Okay, everybody, I think we're going to get started for the sessions after break. Thanks for coming back promptly. We'll get some other folks in the room before the session is over, but I would like to thank Sarbari Gupta, founder and CEO of Electrosoft Services, to the stage. She's going to talk about a shared service model to promote adoption of FIDO2.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Oh, okay. I see a lot of familiar faces here, which is nice, of course. I wish a few more people would come in from their networking break, but we'll see how that goes. Anyway, as Zach said, I'm Sarbari Gupta. I'm with Electrosoft Services, and we are a federal government contractor and have been for over 20 plus years. And we do a lot of work in cybersecurity and identity management and a whole bunch of other more generic IT projects. So my topic today is a shared services model to promote rapid adoption of FIDO2 within federal government. Now that's a very long title, I understand, but I actually had to leave out a couple of important words from the title to make it short enough to fit on the slide, which is the word enterprise users. So I'm not going to be talking about embracing FIDO2 by the federal government for the purposes of citizen-facing services, because government has a lot of those, as you all know. But it's primarily how do we get government agencies to embrace FIDO2 or passkeys. I see everybody's using passkeys instead of FIDO2 now, but my whole slide is built on FIDO2, so that's what I'll use. But how to embrace FIDO2 credentials for enterprise users within government, which means federal employees and contractors. And the shared services model, so parsing the title some more. So what is that all about? So within government, as you all know, and many of you are from government here that I can see, there's a lot of regulation and all kinds of mandates and requirements. And so to adopt FIDO2 within federal government for their enterprise users, there's a whole bunch of requirements that make it much, much more challenging to implement as opposed to a commercial environment. And so in this highly regulated environment, my position is, or what I've been working with a particular government agency on, is how a shared services model is really a very beneficial approach to that. I didn't even take my clicker, so let me do that. Okay, so agenda-wise, I'll be covering the current challenges, the current landscape for federal identity, and then what are the challenges, as I kind of started describing already, for FIDO2 adoption within federal government, and then get into the meat of the presentation, which is the proposed shared services model or solution or approach, and then wrap up, of course. Okay, current landscape. So I'm sure most of you know that within federal government, US federal government, employees and contractors who serve federal government, they are required by law to have a credential called a PIV card for civilian and CAC, the Common Access Card for the DoD sector. And it's a smart card-based credential. In fact, about 20 years ago, I think January of 2005, the standard for the PIV card was published, FIPS 201. And in fact, I'm dating myself, but I was involved as a contractor supporting NIST and developing a lot of the content for FIPS 201. So it's very near and dear to my heart. And so, PIV cards are wonderful. They're smart cards. And they have a bunch of PKI-based credentials, which are also, again, very strong technology. But the years have passed. Most of us, we love our mobile devices and the multiple mobile devices we have. And smart card readers aren't very user-friendly. It's not very easy to use on a mobile device in most cases. And so how do we get across that? And additionally, PKI, again, I grew up I learned identity in the sort of time when PKI was just getting introduced to the federal government. And I love the technology. It's really strong, but it's not very user-friendly. Whoever has dealt with it probably knows that and will agree with me. So how do we move away from PKI? So about 10 years ago, NIST published a guideline for how to issue derived PIV credentials for use on mobile devices. And then over the years, a couple of other OMB memos were published and et cetera. But now, with the latest publication of that NIST guideline, 800-157, it is possible to issue derived PIV credentials, which are not PKI credentials. They are even non-PKI credentials are allowed. And so, so that's kind of what creates the context for DFCs, or what I call derived FIDO2 credentials. So what are they? Essentially, a PIV card, what is it? What does it represent? It represents the full life cycle of an identity within a federal enterprise, basically. So when a person joins the federal government or gets a new contract to support the federal government, they go through an elaborate identity proofing step to prove who they are, and then they get enrolled, and there's a PIV account set up for them, and they get a PIV card, a smart card. And so this PIV account, tracks the user throughout their involvement with that enterprise. So through that process, they might have to get it rekeyed. They might have to get, a new card if they lose their card or it gets damaged. And when they leave the employment of that federal agency, or the contract on which they were working on ends, the PIV account is terminated. So it's a full life cycle process that covers that enterprise user. However, if we talk about FIDO2, while we all love FIDO2, that's what this whole conference is about, but it really doesn't address the full life cycle, right? There are many gaps before you get the credential and after you get the credential, how long can you use it? And there's no way to revoke a FIDO2 credential similar to PKI. So those are some of the gaps, right? But what happens is if you combine FIDO2 with the PIV card or the PIV account, you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get the lifecycle management that PIV provides you, as well as the ease of use, the ubiquity of support, I guess, on different platforms, browsers, et cetera, and of course the the phishing resistance that FIDO2 provides. And so in a way, it's a marriage made in heaven. However, there's always but, right? So in order to do FIDO2 credentials based on the PIV card, you have to bind them together in some way, right? And you can only issue a FIDO2 credential to a PIV card holder once you prove that they hold a PIV card that's actually active and that they have it, and then they can authenticate with it. And moreover, after that FIDO2 credential is issued to that PIV card holder, they can use it, of course, just like any other FIDO2 credential, but with each use, you have to make sure that the original PIV account is still active, because what you don't want is a situation where the person, let's say, left the employment of the federal agency, they still have their derived FIDO2 credential, and they're able to log in and get services for enterprise account that shouldn't even exist, right? Shouldn't be active. Okay, so what are the challenges? Okay, so actually, let me go back. One thing that I forgot to mention, so the middle segment of the slide is all about the additional requirements for DFCs stemming from NIST SP 800-157. And in order to meet all these requirements, what is necessary is that the FIDO2 provider has to have an ability to talk to the agency identity management system to ask things like, is this PIV account active at this point? Can I issue a DFC? Or later, when a person is authenticating with their DFC, it has to ask, is this account active? Should I allow this authentication to be successful? And so with all these APIs or the requirements to talk to the IDMS comes a bunch of technical challenges. And so essentially, in order for a particular US government agency to implement derived FIDO2 credentials, they have to do a lot of infrastructure changes. They have to implement it, right, internally. And so that's like the third major bullet there. But once you implement it, it's also quite challenging to do O&M, operations and maintenance with that system because of the complexity of it. And then because of that API I spoke about, it's possible that unless you manage it and keep it standardized, it's entirely possible that some sort of picture like this can come up, where different DFC or FIDO2 providers establish proprietary APIs to talk to agency IDMSs, because lacking a standard, there isn't a standard for such an API at this point. And so if these proprietary APIs kind of crop up, then you can get into very much of a spaghetti situation, which none of us want, right? The business challenges of agencies implementing their own derived FIDO2 infrastructure are also several. Number one is because of the added requirements for government use of FIDO2 for enterprise users, there needs to be a lot of vetting of the FIDO2 providers before an agency can select them and procure their services or their products, And so for the larger agencies, this may not be a big problem. They have a lot of technical talent on their teams or contractor talent, whatever it is. But for the smaller agencies, and when I say small, I know as a contractor to government, we've supported agencies that are all of like 60 person strong. The entire staff of the agency is 60 people. Now, within the 60 people strong agency, you can imagine they probably don't have a lot of technical expertise, especially with FIDO2 or identity, right? So how are they going to do this kind of vetting? So some sort of governance would be great if there was a list of approved FIDO2 providers that agencies could use. And then the high cost. So for each implementation that an agency takes on for derived FIDO2 credentials, I mentioned the technical complexity, but it's also at a high cost, right, as you can imagine. And then third, the possible vendor lock-in. That seems kind of counterintuitive because FIDO2 was, and all the testing related to FIDO2, it's exactly to prevent vendor lock-in. However, what happens is, because of that API or the requirement to talk to the IDMS, it's possible that those are proprietary, right? Because there is no standard for that at this point, as I said. And because of those APIs, after having implemented it, the agency can very well find itself in a position where it cannot shake off a vendor that's implementing their derived FIDO2 infrastructure. Because if they do, they'll have to start over again, with that API call. Okay, so now we get into the shared services solution. So why shared? Again, if it was easy enough for each agency to do it on their own, it wouldn't make sense to even conceive of a shared solution, right? But within the government, we already have a very good example of a shared services solution which has been working well. I mentioned the PIV cards, right? So PIV cards are also not trivial to implement. And in the early days after the standard was released, many agencies went down that path to issue PIV cards on their own. And they faced a lot of similar challenges that I'm talking about. And so at some point, GSA, the General Services Administration, they set up a shared services project, like environment, where agencies could just pay by the drink almost to get PIV cards, as many PIV cards as they want. And the infrastructure and the functions and the, the different stages of the process, they were all managed by the shared services environment. And so, so what would a shared services concept look like for derived FIDO2 credentials? Okay, so there's a lot of stuff on this picture, so let me try to take it apart for you. So on the right side of the screen, you'll see it's called DFC identity provider. So there's 4 of them in this picture. But essentially, these are, let's say, FIDO2 providers which have been vetted to be able to meet the requirements related to federal government use. And then I talked about an API a couple of times already, or several times. So part of the whole concept is to develop a shared API or a common API for FIDO2 providers to make calls to ask and to interact with the IDMS or the core functions that they need to do with the IDMS. And because agencies have very different identity management systems, there's no mandate you have to use the same one. So there's a whole bunch of vendors who provide IDMSs to different agencies. And so that's why we need something like a federal trust broker. We called it FTB. And that's a middleman which basically collects data from different agency IDMSs regarding the PIV account status for those agencies' users. So if you have, let's say, 5 agencies which have signed up with the shared services, they will push the PIV account status data to this middleman, the federal trust broker. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. Okay, so the same thing, the components, let's look at it in a slightly different sort of, slice and dice it in a slightly different way. So there's the DFC marketplace that's on the green box on your upper right. So that's, again, the marketplace of approved FIDO2 providers who can work in the federal enterprise sort of environment, and meet all the requirements. And so there's a bunch of them that are applicants, they want to play in the game, and others which are already approved, right? Okay, so and then on the bottom, the blue boxes, those are multiple federal agencies who wish to avail of the shared services model for derived FIDO2 credentials. And within each box, you'll see there's a bunch of users, the enterprise users. And each agency will have a bunch of relying party applications, that maybe, that the enterprise users want to get to. And agencies also have the identity management system that they've selected and implemented over the years for their PIV systems. And then in the middle, the big orange or pink or whatever color that is, and that's the DFC shared services sort of component. And it has two subcomponents, okay? So there's the governance piece, which is what actually vets the different FIDO2 providers to make sure that they can comply with the requirements and audits them and such, occasionally to manage that set. And then there's a federation hub, which, as I'll show in some of the subsequent slides that I have 9 minutes left, okay, so let me go quickly the slides so that you'll see how, federation assertions coming from the approved FIDO2 providers can then be, it can be relayed, I guess, through another assertion to the agency relying parties. So now let's look at how it all comes together. How does it work? Okay, so establishing the DFC marketplace, essentially, as I said, it would be wonderful if somebody in the government, let's say in a common manner, could vet FIDO2 providers to ensure that they are capable of supporting all the requirements, for this environment and establishing a marketplace for those. And how that happens is these IDPs or providers, they apply for approval, and the governance component of the DFC shared services block, it does the vetting and the approvals. And as a part of that approval, it also sets up a federation trust agreement so that, it can trust the assertions that are coming from these FIDO2 providers later on, as we'll see. And also there's a periodic audit needed. Now why? Because nothing stands still, right? You approve a provider and you think that they're doing the right thing today, but 6 months from now, 12 months from now, in this day and age, software moves on. So there has to be some sort of ongoing audit to manage this marketplace. Okay, so now let's talk about, let's just envision that a bunch of FIDO2 providers that want into the, the federal enterprise use case, they get approved, so they are part of this marketplace. And now agencies are wanting to sign up, right? So how does an agency do that? How do they engage with the shared services? So first of all, well, there's a lot of contractual paperwork. I'm not talking about those, right? This is a technical discussion. But beyond that, one of the first things the agency would have to do is to select one of the approved FIDO2 providers or FIDO2 IDPs within the green box over there. And following that, they are going to set up a federation trust agreement so that the agency relying parties can trust assertions, federation assertions coming from the federation hub within the orange box over there. And the third thing that I kind of talked about before is that agency has to agree to periodically push the account status for all of their PIV card holders up to the shared service hub. Why? Because it's going, well, we'll see why. Okay, let me just go into that right now. Okay, so now a particular agency, let's say agency ABC, has signed up with the shared service, and user within agency ABC wants to get a DFC, meaning a derived FIDO2 credential, right? So how does that happen? So the user, one way or the other, gets a URL or a link to the selected identity provider, that has been selected by that agency, I guess, as part of the sign-up process. The user goes to that DFC provider and says, I want a new DFC. Now, by definition, derived FIDO2 credential means that they have to prove they have an active PIV card, right? So they have to authenticate using their PIV or their CAC. And if that succeeds, then the identity provider has to now check, okay, is this user actually an active PIV account holder? Is this an active PIV account? And so that's where the step B, as you can see, check PIV account status. So that's a call that the identity provider makes to this shared service hub. And if the answer is yes, then a new DFC is created or allowed to be created. And that's the normal FIDO2 sort of enrollment and creation process, right? But once that DFC is created, it has to be bound to the PIV account for that user. As I discussed before, a FIDO2 credential and isolation has no concept of lifecycle management. It has to be bound, right? And so that new DFC that was created has to be associated with that PIV account, let's say. And okay, so that's all I want to talk about here. And then the next slide is where the user is trying to access some service, from an application, relying party application within their agency. So they first go to the step one is they request service from that application, but the application is unable to, they get redirected, in the way the web works. They'll get redirected to the appropriate IDP, the identity provider, and now the user has the opportunity to use their brand new shiny DFC and authenticate as whoever they are, right? Now the IDP, hopefully, they can perform the authentication and check whether the user is the right user. But so the IDP sends a, what step is that? Number 3, an assertion to the federal trust broker or the federation hub, I guess. It gets very complicated at this point. But the federation hub, what does it need to do? Now, at this point, it has been established that the DFC is valid and it can be used for authentication, fine. But we still don't know whether that user's PIV account is currently active, right? And so the Federation Trust Hub, the Federation Hub, I wish I had a pointer here. But anyway, the hub, what it does is it checks its local database because it's been collecting the PIV account status for that agency's users all along, right? Let's say on a daily basis. So it checks that database to see, okay, is this user's account still active? If it is, then all is good. And so in that case, the Federation Hub creates a brand new assertion to send to the agency relying party, which is step number 5. And the agency relying party now can provide the requested service to the user. Now what happens, for example, in the scenario I talked about earlier, which is the user was was employed by a federal agency, but they've left their job or they've been discharged, right? But they still have a good DFC on one of their mobile devices. And so this is the point where that's going to be found out, right? Hopefully the PIV account has already been terminated. And so when that Trust Federation Hub, that orange, I guess, whatever, within the orange box, let's say, when it checks the status of the PIV account, it'll see that, well, this PIV account is terminated. And at that point, it will still send an assertion to the relying party, but it won't be a successful one. It'll say, no, the user was not able to be authenticated, right? And so that's kind of how it all works. And so wrap up. So what are the advantages of this shared services model? So since it's a combination of FIDO2 and shared services, so you'll see what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 advantages here are benefits. The security and the interoperability advantages are clearly tied to the FIDO2 credential itself. Those are core properties of passkeys or FIDO2. But with the shared services model, though, the additional benefits you get are things like scalability, especially for medium to small agencies, they can easily scale up and pay, again, per issuance of DFC or however the model works out. It doesn't matter, but it's much more scalable. It's cost efficient, and also in terms of compliance, the agency doesn't have to worry about it. It's taken care of by the shared service, right? That's the whole point. And so there's a lot of advantages to this, and why am I talking about it? I've been working with the GSA Office of Government-Wide Policy for about 1.5 years now to kind of refine this concept. And so we've had multiple iterative versions of this architecture that I just presented to you. And we've sought a lot of extensive stakeholder engagement, and stakeholders meaning other federal agencies, whether they might find this kind of concept useful, stakeholders meaning NIST getting their feedback on whether this makes any sense based on the requirements they put out, and with the vendor population, the FIDO2 vendor set, to seek their inputs on what works, what doesn't work. And so that's kind of how it's been going for a while, and at this point, there are ongoing discussions. I can't reveal specific agency names, but there is active discussion regarding a particular agency picking up the shared service operations at this point. So we'll see. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it might just happen. And in summary, I mean, mentioned various things over the last 20 minutes, but the shared services model, in my opinion, or in the opinion of those of us working on this, makes a lot of sense because of the complexity of derived FIDO2 credentials. And the call to action would be that, federal agencies, if there are representatives here, consider this as an opportunity to jump on the FIDO2 bandwagon. Now, the shared service doesn't actually exist yet. It's just a concept and a lot of talk. But on the other hand, hopefully, in a year, it might be operational, and then you can go ahead and do that. And so, thank you. With 1 second to spare. Okay.
Thank you, Sarbari. I think one time for one quick question.
Very good. Hey, so my read of 2013 in 217 seems to put some emphasis on the whoever issued the parent PIV being the issuer of things derived from it. I'm curious how you think this plays with that.
Great question, and that was one of the early questions that came up a lot. Yes, 157 does say that, Rev 1, and FIPS 201 as well, I think, makes mention of that. But just like US access, I mean, the agency can always decide to either do it in-house or to employ a contractor to delegate that responsibility. So in a sense, this is what's going on here, Even for PIV cards, I mean, the requirement is for agencies to issue PIV cards to their employees, right? Or contractors, but they can choose to go with the GSA shared services, through US access and do it that way. So we are envisioning that, and in fact, Andy is right here. We talked to the NIST team, of course, whether this kind of a model is allowable or practical, and I think we got a somewhat positive answer. That's why we proceeded with this, yeah.
Great. Well, Sarbari, thank you so much for the presentation.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you all for attending. We're going to pick up in a couple of minutes with a presentation about Michigan's implementation of passkeys.